So this session's all going to be about bias binding, and I want you to make these 3 samples. I've made them quite big, but I've layered them on top of each other when I mounted them into my book. So the first one is bias binding on a curve, so it's binding front and back. The second one is just on a straight edge, binding front and back. We've already done in the hems just hemming up, so using the bias binding on one side. So this time it is binding the front and back at the same time. And then we're going to do a corner, so binding front and back with a single piece. And I've used a striped fabric to show you. It's easier to see how it works with the striped fabric. But don't worry, you don't need to do striped. I've just done it for the visual. So there are your 3 samples that you need to do for this session. So making bias binding. Our last session we talked about the warp and the weft of the fabric and the bias. So pretend this piece of paper is fabric, so your warp is the length of the fabric with the selvage side, and your weft is going across. So these are your grain lines, cross grain, your up and down grain. And then when you fold your fabric, the corner, the weft side here, meeting the warp there, and fold it across, and this diagonal line becomes your bias. So that gives your fabric stretch. So on the fabric, same thing, you're turning that corner down. You can see the bias of the fabric here. It's got give in it, it stretches. So you see those bias cut dresses? So if they're cut on that angle, they hug the body. So that's a reason for bias. It goes around the body nicely, and plus for bias binding, when you're going around on a garment with your piping and stuff like that, it will go around these curves more smoothly. So this is a piping on the edge of a bodice. So if I would have done that on the straight, it would have been all choppy and look like 50p piece, like flat choppy edges. So being on the bias gives you that smoothness of going around curves. So a quick way of cutting: you've got your fabric like this, you folded it down, and then you start cutting on that angle. So a quick way you can do it, because your fabric would be really wide, probably 120 up to 145, 150. If you fold it like this, the 2 corners in, like that, turn it this way, and you can start. I'm just going to use the width of the ruler. If you get a rotary blade, and decide how deep you want to cut it, and you keep doing that. And then you've got your strips, your bias strips. And when you join bias strips, you need to join them on the diagonal. So if you put them like this, pin them and then machine them with the small little hem, 1/4 inch hem will be fine. And then when you fold them up, you get this diagonal join So once you've joined it on the diagonal, open up your seam allowance so it's the bulks distribute both sides. And it being on an angle, what that happens is when you wrap it around the piping or around the edge of something, it will distribute the bulk on an angle, so you can see it's across. Because if you joined it straight across like this, you get all the bulk in one area, concentrated in one area, and it'd just be a big lump. So it's better to join them on a diagonal. And when you attach it to your garment, make sure you put the join in a discrete area near the back or on the side under the arm, so it's not as obvious. Sometimes if you do it really well, you can barely even see it. So yeah, always join bias binding on the diagonal. We're going to cut bias binding. So you would cut your fabric at this angle. So a quick way of doing that is fold it in the diagonal. Cut it on that line. And then swap it from here to this side, and you would machine that down. Or in our case, I'm going to tape it. So once you've sewn this down, you would sew it with a 1/4 inch seam and press it open. So I've just taped it for the paper version. Then you decide how wide you want to make your bias bind. I'm just going to go with the width of my ruler for this. And then you would chalk all your however wide you want your bias binding to be. And carry on. And you end up with this. And then what you do, you want to join it together to create a tube. And you want to offset it. So you don't want to join it evenly like this. You want to, where the first row is, move it over one. You would create the tube. So in fabric you would be sewing this. So you can see you've got a tube and it's offset at the beginning and at the end. And then what you start doing is you take a sharp pair of scissors in your fabric, or in this case it's paper, and you just start cutting. And it just creates one big long piece of bias binding. I'm just doing it roughly. Don't you'll get a few joins. It's better on the fabric because it's a lot bigger, so the joins won't be as close as they are on this. And all the joins are on the diagonal. And then you've just got your big long piece, a few meters long, depending how big a piece you use. And you've done it all in one go. So there's not all that fiddly bit of going along. You can see some bits might be a bit too close, but you can just trim them away. But there's less waste this way. So like these ones here, they're not going to be as close on a bigger piece of paper. Yeah, so you've got all your diagonal joins and just a long continuous piece. So if you've got a lot of bias binding to do, that's a good way of saving on wastage. If you're just doing a few small bits, just cut them on the diagonal like I showed you with the rotary blade. So once you've created your bias binding, depending on what you're using it, how you're using it, when you buy the store-bought bias binding, it's already pre-ironed. So to create it so it looks like the store-bought stuff, you usually buy these little gadgets for bias binding, and what you do is you feed them into it. And you pull them through and you press them. But these are quite expensive. They're about £7, £8, and you need one for each size, so it can become quite expensive. So cheap way of doing it, invest in a large needle, millinery needle. This one's a little bit bigger than a millinery needle, just as long as it's a long pin, and then you just on your ironing board. Millinery one's better, my millinery one's gone missing. And you just create a space like this. So if you feed your bias binding, pre-fold it and feed it under the pin, and then you can, as you go along, use your iron. Making sure you leave a little gap in, about 5-6 millimeter little gap, and you can pre-iron all your bias binding. It's quite quick way of doing it. And then if you wanted it folded in half again, that's why you need to leave the gap and fold it up and press it again. So you can create a load of bias binding quite quickly and cheaply, a lot cheaper than buying it pre-made. Just invest in a large pin. Be careful when you pull the pin out, because you've been pressing. It can get really hot, so let it cool down before you pull it out. Good investment, large millinery needle. Don't get too thick because it's hard to push it through the fabric on the millinery ones are perfect. So bias binding on a straight edge. So if you got your fabric, this is the top of your fabric, and you got your bias binding, so the two fronts facing each other on the top. Pin it in place. And then you would come and machine it. So I've machined it, and then I'm going to press it forward. Make sure you, when you machine it, that you lock both ends. And you can see, because this is on the bias binding, it's got a little bit of give in it. then turn it over. And your stitch line is your guide. So if you fold your fabric under on the other side and just put it slightly over that stitch line. And you can pin it in place. Don't be mean with your bias binding, because if you just have a tiny bit to turn, it's really difficult. You need a decent turn, and usually about the depth from here, so it turns, but it's not buckling. So have a good turn, yeah, and make sure it looks all even once you pinned it in place. So you want them to be even front and back. So if you go too far past your stitch line here, one side will look deeper than the other. So you're just barely passing the stitch line. Yeah? And if you look at it, you can see the light through it, whether you can see the shadow of the one behind. If it looks too deep, make it narrower. And then you would just come along and slip stitch. So we all know how to slip stitch. So you're slip stitching, you go along the crease and come, you can see the turquoise thread, just this side of it, pick up 1 or 2 fibers. Then back up again along the crease, 1 or 2 fibers. Again, and it helps if you don't press your bias binding really well, if you just finger press it or softly iron it, so that you haven't got a really hard line along here on this fold. Because when you got a hard line, it makes it difficult to feed your needle in that crease. So don't pre-press it too much. Yeah. And then you can come along, give it a good press. So the inside is hand stitched, the outside is the machine stitch. You can see the difference. The machine stitch is looks more neater and finished, and the hand stitch, it still looks neat, but it's not as neat as where the machine is. So machine side is the outer side, the front, that's going to be seen, and the inside do the hand stitching. So you're going to use this stitch to finish off all your bias binding samples. Yeah. Right, so we're gonna bias bind around a curved edge this time. And if you just draw yourself a soft curve with the pencil, just use your hand and sweep it around. And it's a good idea if you do a stay stitch, just a few, like 2 or 3 millimeters into your seam allowance. So when you cut something on a curve, it becomes stretchy because it's in these areas here on the bias. So if you do the stay stitch, it stabilizes it. And then get your bias binding piece and just go the other side of that stay stitch, pin it in place. You can trim it, or in this case I'm not trimming it because it's only a small sample, and it helps to keep it stable, that it's still square. Plus the stay stitch helps it stay stable. But if you're on a garment and the curve is already being cut, then I would definitely do your stay stitch to stop it stretching. Right, so I'm going to machine this and then I'll come back. So I've machined my line around. You can see where the stay stitch is. I've sewn it onto my line and I'm going to trim this away. And then when you turn it around, you probably get away with this one without clipping it because it's narrow. But if you find it's pulling, just use the tip of your scissors and you're just literally put the point to the stitch line. Do not do this because if you slip you'll cut through and you'll have to start over again. So about 1/2 inch gaps I'm doing. And then that helps release the fabric, so then you can come along and just give it a little bit of a press. Turn it over to the other side. And then you can turn it and use your stitch line like last time as your guide. And don't iron this too hard because it makes it, slows you down when you're slip stitching. So yeah, and then you can come along, just hold it in place. So again, make sure you're not too far down, that you're just gonna catch, that you're just gonna, when you slip stitch, you're just this side of the stitch line. So you don't want this to be longer than that. The only time you would have that longer is say you wanted to do this whole thing by machine and you had pre-made bias binding. You could just slip it along the edge, this slightly longer on the inside, and then you can just come and top stitch through the whole lot. But it depends what you're doing it for. So if you want it something really nice, machine one side first, slip stitch the other side. Corner. So making a bias bound corner, I've got my bias binding. It's about 2 inches wide. I fold it in half. I've given it a light press, and I will pin it along the straight edge here, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I will stop at this corner. I want to stop stitching, leaving a 1/4 seam allowance here. And I'm just putting my pin head so to remind me that pin head is where I want to stop my stitching, so I've left my 1/4 seam allowance going down the other direction. And then what you do is you machine there, you stop, lock it, and then miter this up so it's flush with this top edge. And it's coming down the other edge. So like this. And then you will machine down this side. Yeah? So come and machine down here. So this side I've done it. And if you give it a little press, push it around, away from the edges, and then you turn it to the opposite side, and you can see this kind of just automatically falls into a miter. And you turn it over, you line your folded edge up with your stitch line, give it a little press, try not to press this too much here, and then turn the other side down, and you can to meet the stitch line here, and just fiddle with it till you get a nice mitered corner, and then give it a press. And then what you can do is come along and slip stitch around here. A nice finished edge front and back. So you see this a lot on quilts. People do quilt and do this, bind the edges of quilts like this. So it's a quick way of doing it. So this little trick of having a double edge, you can use that on the other ones as well, but it depends how thick your fabric is and your binding. It works with light cottons and light fabrics, but heavier fabrics you can't do it. You need to do it in this single fashion. So if you wanted to do the curve or the straight edge, you'd just do the same thing. Fold your bias in half, pin it along, machine it, and then you can turn it over and you've already got your edge folded. But this makes this thicker, so you need to judge your fabrics all on their own merit depending on what you're using. Yeah. So that is your bound edges, bound curve, bound hem, and bound on a corner. So if you mount them like that for your samples, for your sample book.